morning to all. It is for me indeed an honor, and it gives me great personal pleasure to welcome Minister Eduardo Guardia. I've known the Minister for many years and have a heartfelt admiration for his competence, integrity, and dedication to public service. Eduardo Guardia was a memorable Secretary of the Treasury in the last year of the Cardoso administration, navigating with assurance the turbulent waters caused by the October 2002 election, including the ensuing currency crisis and the need to negotiate a new agreement with the IMF. Before that, he was a member of the Ministry of Finance team that helped privatize Banespa, at the time the largest state-owned bank in Brazil. He was the Secretary of Finance of the state of São Paulo in the first administration of Governor Alckmin. And during this time, he helped negotiate a very difficult agreement regarding interstate taxation and the fiscal federalist system, something that he's still working on today. Not because he hasn't been able to do more, but because of the difficulty and the political intractability of these problems. He has held important and prestigious jobs in the private sector and in academia. Most of all, however, Minister Guardia was the indispensable steward of the reforms that have taken place during the Temer administration. These are seminal achievements for the Brazilian economy and society, which I expect he will talk about. And he has ambitious plans for more reforms in the coming months. Please welcome Minister Eduardo Guardia.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Paulo for the kind introduction, to thank Gabriela and Ted for inviting me to be here today. It's a pleasure to be here, a good opportunity to talk about what we are doing in Brazil, the challenges, and our biggest concerns for the next few months. What I'll try to do today is to go very quickly over the presentation. I'm pretty sure you are all very much familiar with Brazil. So I'll just try to convey a few messages and try to give us more time to answer your questions so we can have a very open debate about Brazil. I'll try to cover three main topics. First one is to talk a little bit about growth and the perspectives. Second, of course, emphasize a few aspects related to the fiscal challenges that we still have in Brazil. And then I will go over our main projects related to the continuity of the reform agenda that we have in Brazil. So that's my brief presentation today, and as I said, I will go very quickly. First, as you all know, we left behind the worst depression and recession we have ever had in Brazil. Brazil is growing. The discussion today is whether we are going to grow 3%, 2.8%. The fund has more conservative numbers for Brazil. I can explain why I think the fund assumptions are a little bit more conservative, but the message is clear. We are recovering growth, and the economy is growing, in our view, in a sustainable path. When we look to the numbers of GDP composition by sector, industry is growing, services is growing, and very important, investment is growing. So we have household consumption growing and investment growing on a sustainable path. And I think this is a very important number to highlight. We have investment in capital goods growing and durable goods consumptions growing as well. So this is very good news for us, and more important. I think it's more important than discussing if we are going to grow 2.8 or 3%, is that all the economy is growing. And what's behind this, I think we were able, since the beginning of Temer administration, to restore the confidence in the Brazilian economy, because now we have the right policies put in place. Our crisis, it's always important to emphasize, was not related to external factors, but to our own mistakes in terms of economic policy in the past. And we will discuss more about that when we talk about the fiscal. Of course, central bank has done an outstanding job, so inflation is under control. Interest rates has declined significantly, 775 bips since the beginning of our administration. Central bank has been very good to coordinate expectations with respect to inflation. And as I said, inflation absolutely under control over the last 12 months, around 2.8%. So this is very important. This I always like to emphasize, because now companies deleverage and households as well reduced significantly their debt level. So this is very important when we think about growth perspectives going forward. So the environment is very good to continue to grow, as long as we will discuss, we continue with the reforms. Last but not least, external sector numbers are very comfortable. So this is particularly important when we know that we have elections this year. This may add some volatility. Perspectives for the world economy in the short term are good, but it's always good to have the necessary protections to be prepared for more adverse scenarios going forward. So this is another important number to emphasize, and of course the external reserves that we have at $383 billion. And employment is beginning to increase. We have had a small reduction in employment growth recently, but we believe it is part of this recovery process. The depression was very intense, but clearly, as we can see on this chart, employment is also moving in the right direction. So these are the numbers that everyone knows. What's important to emphasize is to preserve these achievements that we have seen. We have to continue to move in the directions of fiscal consolidation, and we have to continue to implement the reform agenda that we have today. So this is clearly what everyone in this room knows. So what I'll try to do is what's the challenges for the next months during this administration. A few numbers about the fiscal, again, very quickly. The main reason behind this huge fiscal deterioration was the growth of primary expenditures in Brazil. Just one number. Brazil was running a primary surplus around 3% of GDP from the beginning of the 2000 until 2013-14. Now we are running a primary deficit close to 2%. So it was a 5% of GDP fiscal deterioration. What's behind that is the growth of primary expenditures, particularly the mandatory expenditures like pension benefits. What we have done, we approved the spending cap, so this spending cap that you all know, but what I want to emphasize here is the strategy behind the fiscal consolidation we have. It's a gradual approach. Why? Because we knew that it would not be a good strategy to try to raise tax in the middle of the worst recession we ever had. So the approach had to be the gradual one to reduce public expenditures and return the level of expenditures to 15% of GDP, which was the level we had before Dilma administration. So that's what we will achieve with the spending cap. So we have 10 years to return to that level, approximately 0.5% of GDP per year. What's the challenge? The challenge is that the spending cap will not be feasible if we do not approve the pension reform, because pension benefits will continue to grow, and therefore there will be a compression of discretionary expenditure. So this is the biggest challenge, and that's why pension reform is absolutely necessary from the fiscal point of view. That's what will make it feasible to implement the gradual approach that we have in Brazil today, and which was very well accepted by market participants. Everyone understands that we need time to adjust, but we have to give a clear sign that we are moving in the right direction, addressing the key issues, which is the pension reform. So probably we'll talk about the pension reform during the Q&A. but that's one point I always have to emphasize. This is what is still pending in Brazil, and we have to approve this reform. Last week, we released some numbers about perspectives for the fiscal going forward, because we have in Brazil a legal obligation. We have in April every year, we have to set the fiscal target for the next year. So we had to release these projections 2 weeks ago. And what we decided to do, we decided to be conservative, because we are going to set the legal target for the primary deficit for the next administration. So what was the assumption behind that? We said, well, let's suppose, and this is a reasonable assumption, that we will respect the spending cap, and let's be conservatives in terms of revenue forecast, which type of conservative approach I'm talking about. We are not considering this number any new measure considering related to tax increase, and we are being conservative in terms of GDP growth. We are just considering here, with the exception of this year and next year, the potential GDP growth without reforms, which is 2.3%, 2.4%. So the message here is that all the numbers that we have just released that are behind this debt sustainability exercise are based on very conservative assumptions, because we were setting the legal target for the next administration. So we decide to do not consider any additional measure, because we are not going to be responsible for implementing these measures. So the message here is, when you look at the numbers that we are releasing, it's, in my view, reasonable to expect that we can have a much better performance than this. And the key issue is, if you continue to move in the direction of the structural reform agenda that we have today, not only GDP will grow more, because it will have a very important impact on GDP growth potential, but also we will have a very, because the economy will grow more, we will have more tax revenue, and we may have the continuity of the concession programs that will add revenue. So my message to you is, the numbers that we are looking are conservative numbers, and if we continue with the reform agenda, Brazil can do much better than what we are looking in this chart. But even in this conservative scenario, if we approve pension reform and and be able, and therefore become able to enforce the spending cap, we see the sustainability of the public debt. So this is the biggest concern, of course, when you talk about the fiscal. So what's behind all of that? Structural reforms. Pension reform, as I said many times today, is the most important one. We know that during this year, it's not going to be easy to approve pension reform. We have elections. And by the way, as you know, we have the intervention in Rio de Janeiro because of security issues. And according to our constitution, we cannot approve constitutional reforms when we have a federal intervention in any of the states. So even if we wanted to discuss pension reform this year, we are not allowed to continue this discussion as long as we still have the intervention in Rio de Janeiro. But even without the pension reform, there is a lot of important, these are what we have already done, you all know that, so I think what's important is to discuss what we have going forward. And we have a lot of important discussions in Congress nowadays. I will not go through all these 15 projects, but I would like to emphasize a few of them. And the idea is, and this is the key message, when we look to each of these reforms individually, they not necessarily will have a strong impact on growth going forward. But when we put all of them together, we are confident that these will increase potential GDP growth and will have a very important impact in Brazil, because this will increase, reduce Brazil costs on one hand, and we will also increase the productivity of our economy. So let me mention just a few of these reforms, and then, of course, I can go into more details during the Q&A if you have a special interest in one of them. Tax simplification is very important, and this is one message here. Is all of us know that Brazil do need a more comprehensive tax reform. It's clear to all of us. But it's not feasible to expect that we will be able to approve a comprehensive tax reform today during this year. So what we want to do, we want to have to move in the right direction with a very important step, which is the simplification of PIS/COFINS. For those of you who operate in Brazil, you know the difficulties you have related to the complexity of PIS/COFINS and also the VAT, the value-added tax at the state level, the ICMS. So the idea is to send two bills to Congress to simplify the rules of PIS/COFINS and the ICMS. So this is very important, and in my view, that's the only way if you want in the future to have, let's say, a unified VAT tax. First, you have to deal with the problems at the ECMS and the PIS/COFINS, otherwise it will be very difficult to unify these two taxes going in the future. So this very important step. We are ready to send this proposal to Congress. We just need some internal discussion in the government. So soon we expect to send this tax simplification proposal. So this is very important. Second, Eletrobras privatization. This is one of the priorities for the year. And again, it's not because of the positive fiscal impact that we will have with the privatization of Eletrobras. So this is important, but what really matters to us is that we need to capitalize Eletrobras. Eletrobras is responsible for 1/3 of the generation of energy in Brazil, so you cannot have a serious discussion about energy investments in Brazil without a strong and capitalized Eletrobras. The Treasury does not have the money to capitalize the company, and we need the private sector investing in Eletrobras, improving the corporate governance of Eletrobras to make sure we will have a very strong company to compete and to eliminate possible bottlenecks in this important sector. The model that we have decided is that we are going to have a primary offer, so we will capitalize Eletrobras, we will dilute the federal government that will not, of course, participate in this offer, and we may even have some secondary offer to adjust the stake that we want to have in Eletrobras. And it's going to be a true corporation. We will have some limitation to vote up to more than 10% of the total capital. So we want a capitalized, strong company with good corporate governance. So that's one of the priorities for the year. Another one that I forgot to mention, as Gabriela said, about investment opportunities in Brazil, is one important discussion that we have with Petrobras today about, maybe you're familiar with the issue, that's so-called transfer rights. So we are very close to have an agreement with Petrobras. Of course, I will not comment on that because Petrobras is a listed company. We don't have yet an agreement. So once we have, we will explain. But if we manage to have an agreement with Petrobras on the transfer rights, which is related to the capitalization in 2010, then we will be able to have a huge auction related to the pre-salt reserves. The excess oil that we have in relation to the capitalization of 2010 is huge, so it's a very important opportunity for the government, for Petrobras, and for the country, because we are going to attract billions and billions of dollars in investments in oil and gas. So this is another priority for 2018. We are discussing the review in tax exemptions granted over private payroll. This is an important issue. I always mention this. We have a lot of tax benefits in Brazil, and we have to discuss in details the quality of these tax expenditures. So that's one of the examples of reviewing tax expenditures, which is absolutely necessary in Brazil. If you look from 2010 to 2015, tax benefits in Brazil increased by an amount equivalent to 1 percentage point of GDP. It's a lot of money. So we have to understand who is getting these benefits, if it's and the cost of and benefits of this tax exemption. So this is one important example. We have some other discussions that will help us to reduce the cost of credits for households and small and mid-sized companies. You saw Selic rate falling down, but we still have to work to make sure that this reduction in the basic rate will also benefit our households households and SMEs. So we have two measures here that will help us in this direction. One is the positive credit record. Hopefully we will approve soon in Congress. We have been discussing this with Congress for a long time already. And this will help to reduce and facilitate the access of credit to households. And electronic receivables will be a very efficient alternative in our view, also to increase the access of credit to SMEs and reduce the cost of credit. So this is these are some examples. I'm talking too much, Gabriela. I promised her that I would not talk too much to give more time to the questions. But the message here is clear. We have a strong agenda of reform. We will continue to discuss this agenda with Congress. We have to negotiate with Congress. Brazil is a democracy. Congress has its role in this process. We have the strong support from the Speaker of the House to implement the reform agenda. And so that's our role. It's to show the importance of the reforms, show the cost of not doing the reforms. Sometimes it's even easier to show the cost of not doing the reforms than the benefits of the reform, but we have to convey these two important aspects of the reform agenda. And we are confident that if Brazil continues to move in this right direction, and there are much more to do, we will see potential GDP growth in Brazil increasing significantly. So that's what we want. We want to continue to grow on a sustainable path with low inflation, low interest rates, low unemployment. And by the way, it's still a problem, as you saw in the chart, because employment is growing, but unemployment is still high. So this is one concern we have. So there's no other alternative but to move in the right reform agenda to increase GDP potential going forward. So we'll continue to discuss this agenda with Congress. We believe we will have the support from Congress. There are difficult discussions. Eletrobras is one of them. But we are confident that we are presenting good projects that will, at the end of the day, help Brazil to become much better off, be able to grow on a sustainable path. So this is our commitment, this is the orientation of President Temer, and this is what the economic team is trying to do with all the other ministers of Temer administration. I have with me two colleagues, Marcelo Esteban and Fabio Kanzuki. Another important message that after when Minister Meirelles left 1 week ago, I'm on the job for 1 week only, all the others members of the economic team continue to work with me. So this is very important because this is a teamwork. We have a very competent and dedicated economic team at the Minister of Finance, Minister of Planning, at the Central Bank, and we are all committed, and the government, because this is the President's orientation with the reform agenda. So thank you very much. Now I'll be very glad to answer your questions.
My question to you is about the 2019 outlook. You mentioned that you have already sent the preliminary budget proposal. Is this the year when the expenditure ceiling is going to bite, or are we more restricted by the so-called golden rule, which limits the amount of expenditure of borrowing to capital expenditure?
Thank you for the question, Paulo. This is important. We have basically three fiscal targets that we have to observe. We have the primary target, we have the spending cap, and we have now the golden rule. The golden rule is the constitutional rule that says that we cannot finance current expenditures with debt. It makes a lot of sense, and unfortunately this is the case of Brazil today, because we are running primary debt, and the primary debt is not related to a huge amount of investments. And by the way, our investments went down. So this is a concern. We have deficit, and the deficit is pretty much related to current consumption. So let's look to just to emphasize, 2018, we don't have problems with the target, with the ceiling, and with the golden rule. So we have already It's all in accordance with the existing rules. But then looking at 2019, starting with the primary deficit. The primary deficit was calculated based on this conservative assumption in terms of revenues. So I don't see any problem for the next administration to deliver the primary deficit. Of course, we are considering that expenditures are consistent with the spending cap. So answering your question about the spending cap in 2019, what's going to happen? The problem is, as we didn't approve pension reform, legal expenditures, particularly pension benefits, continue to grow. And therefore, as we have a cap, which is based on last year expenditure plus inflation, what's happening is that the discretionary expenditures will be reduced even more in 2019, sorry. So just let me give you the numbers. For this year, 2018, the discretionary expenditures will be 128 billion reais. This is our forecast for this year. For next year, our forecast, which is the one consistent with the spending cap, is 98 billion reais. So there is another 30 billion reais reduction in primary expenditures. It's possible, of course, it's not easy, but there are alternatives to reduce that, and I just mentioned one of them. When I said that mentioned the tax benefits to companies that do not pay or have fiscal incentives related to pension contribution, social contribution, this is not only a reduction in the revenue, but also it increases expenditures because the Treasury has to compensate the Social Security system. In other words, if we approve this legislation that reduces the tax benefits that companies have today, we will also reduce the Treasury expenditure because the Treasury will not have to compensate the Social Security system anymore. So this is one example of a measure that could improve the fiscal stance next year and give more flexibility to the new administration to comply with the spending cap. So being very objective in the answer, Paulo, the budget is consistent with the spending cap. We have measures that we have to negotiate with Congress, and we will negotiate that can mitigate the difficulties and the problems that we will have next year. So the 98 billion reais budget for discretionary expenditures is feasible, but of course, if we could have approved measures that give more flexibility to the new administration is good. So answering your question, the spending cap will not be the problem next year. About the golden rule next year. So the golden rule will have two alternatives to mitigate this problem, because this will be a problem in 2019. So how we will address this problem? The first one is related to what I have already mentioned. If we are successful to have this auction related to the oil and gas reserves of the pre-salt area, we are talking about a concession to the private sector, and therefore there will be the concession revenue that will be huge, because we are talking about, I don't know, 6 billion, 7 billion, 8 billion barrels of oil, so it's worth a lot of money. And as we have the spending cap, if we have the auction in 2018 this year, we will not spend this money, and therefore the primary surplus this year will be much better. I'm not considering this in my forecast, and not even considering this in the debt dynamics that I showed to you. So this is one of the upsides. So this money will be transferred to the next administration and will help to mitigate the golden rule problem in 2019. It will eliminate the problem? No. So how we will address this? We will use one alternative that is in our constitution, which is we can finance current expenditures if Congress gives a specific authorization to this specific expenditure. So when we send the budget for 2019, we will have to choose specific expenditures that will require special Congress authorization to allow the debt financing. So that's how we are going to deal with the golden rule next year. So the long-term solution, of course, is fiscal adjustment, fiscal consolidation, and return to a primary surplus. But that's how we will deal from the legal point of view with the golden rule next year.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Gabrielle, do you have a question?
Thank you. OECD. Brazil, as you know, is one of the 6 candidate countries awaiting invitation to join the OECD. And Brazil has, of course, long accompanied the work of the OECD, but I think there's probably still homework to do to better align Brazil with some of the OECD standards and principles. From the perspective of Fazenda, with regards to fiscal tax policy, what are the priorities in Fazenda to bridge this gap?
Okay, important to say, Gabriela, although we are not a member of the OECD, we are already consistent with most of the rules from OECD in terms of tax, in terms of trade, and all the areas. And actually, we are a very active player at OECD. Marcelo Estevam, where is Marcelo? Marcelo is here. He works a lot with OECD, and we have a very strong agenda with them. So what I think it's important, of course, we want to be a member of OECD. I don't see any obstacle coming from the institutional framework we have in Brazil today. What's important is the message that we have already conveyed that we want to become part of OECD, and Brazil will continue to move with its policy towards the direction of the OECD countries, and not only OECD. The message that we are trying to convey very clearly is that we want to have we need much more integration with international trade, so we have to open the economy, because this will help us to increase the productivity of Brazilian economy. So this is another important part of the agenda, more international integration. And OECD is only part of this process. So although I don't know when they will decide on that, we know that there are 6 countries. We hope Brazil will be accepted as well, but it's up to them to decide. We will continue to do what we have to do, to implement the right policies, continue to work with OECD, and continue to make it possible for Brazil to be more integrated, particularly in trade agreements. We are now discussing Mercosur and European Union. So that's what we have to do.
Thank you, Minister. We have a question from Necésio Tavares, who is a visiting scholar at Columbia University, and he asks, how do you see the role of the Brazilian Development Bank, BNDES, for the coming years, if any? And what kind of funding should the bank ideally access?
Very good question. We have already changed completely the role of BNDES. We all know what was done in the recent past. So BNDES has been capitalized with the treasury money. Now we are getting this money back, so and BNDES is fully committed to return this money to the treasury. This will be very important for us. And by the way, it's important this year for the golden rule. But what's the role of BNDES? And this is very important. BNDES, they have the part of the tax revenue that goes to BNDES. So they have the source of financing. I think BNDES, the main role for BNDES, in my view, and of course now we have Diogo Oliveira at BNDES, BNDES has to help us to develop capital markets in Brazil. So there are opportunities to become market makers, to develop the corporate bonds sector. So BNDES can play this role. BNDES has a very important role to discuss infrastructure. So how we can finance infrastructure in Brazil with market instruments, how BNDES can help to finance this project financing. So BNDES has to have a leading role in this. BNDES has to broaden their finance capabilities by, for example, issue bonds abroad. They can do that to lend in Brazil. So we don't want BNDES providing cheap credit for Brazilians. And by the way, one of the most important changes we have done last year was the long-term interest rates. We changed the basic rate for BNDES. This is important not only for monetary policy, because if you have subsidized credit, you need more interest rates to have the same effect on monetary policy. It has a fiscal impact. And also, if BNDES is lending money with interest rates that is not set by market, by the market, but from the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Planning, and the Governor of the Central Bank, what happens is they cannot securitize these credits. So if they have credits based in market rates, it's easier to securitize the credits, and therefore they can play this role that I was mentioned to help to develop capital markets. So that's, they will continue to have an important role in financing exports, small and mid-sized companies, all the good work that BNDES has done since the beginning, forever. But I think helping to develop capital markets is the key role that BNDES can play going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Another question about infrastructure from Jerry Owen of Intrix, and he wants to know, if you know, what is the expected FDI from infrastructure extensions and asset sales?
I don't have the number. FDI in general is 80 billion in total, yeah. But specifically I don't know.
Yeah.
It's, we can try to get this number and send to you.
Okay.
One more question.
Okay, one more question. So there is a question from Edson Cadete of Afropress, and what he really wants to know is, he says we've painted a rosy future for Brazil. What about the social situation, the social climate, and in particularly regarding the state intervention in Rio de Janeiro and the unfortunate event with Marielle Franco?
Well, I think we can talk about rosy future if we continue with the reforms. If we do not continue with the reforms, the future will be very challenging in Brazil. We have a lot of social problems in Brazil. One of them is related to security issues, as was mentioned in the question, and that's why, by the way, the federal government had to intervene in Rio de Janeiro. I think the best way for a Minister of Finance to answer this question is to explain what happens when we have fiscal deterioration. Because in my view, all of that is, what's behind that is fiscal deterioration. So Rio de Janeiro is an example today. The state is not able to provide the basic public services, health, education, and security. So that's a reflect of that. So that's why, again, the agenda of reform is the Minister of Finance response to these problems. Of course, we have to have short-term initiatives to mitigate the population that is suffering in Brazil. There are other areas in the government that can talk more about this, but we have a social network that is trying to mitigate the suffering of these people. But the only consistent answer, Paulo, is to continue in the reform agenda, because we are not going to grow. Without growth, states will continue to have the fiscal challenge that they have today, so cannot pay civil servants, they cannot invest in education, in security, so on and so forth. And again, without pension reform, because one of the main reasons behind the imbalance of Rio de Janeiro today is when we look to the payroll of, and not only the active civil servants, but the retiree as well. So without pension reform, states will have a hard time. There's no other alternative. So if you want to address this issue, return to my agenda, to our agenda of reform. So that's the only consistent answer to the problem.
Thank you, Minister. We have a couple of other questions, but we don't have time, so I'll leave them with you,
okay.
And maybe you could address them.
I'll make sure we will answer and send the response.
And so,
thank you.
thank you very much.
Can I get a round of applause?
Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.